Okay, so hi guys, this is Gemma from ASD Rocks with Richard Eisenmeyer from the ASD Clinic. And Richard has his PhD in a very specific area, actually, in mind abilities. Is that correct?
Theory of mind.
Theory of mind within the autism spectrum.
Correct.
And he's been working within the autism world here, I think, for 20 odd years for the ASD clinic.
We've been here about 12 years, but I've worked at various other places for over 20 years. Yeah.
And working within the autism world for
a long time.
Longer than that.
Yes.
Can I ask about Aspergers and I mean, noting that you yourself have something saying, imagine having Asperger's. I personally, I don't sit well with the Asperger word. I'm a spectrum person.
Fine.
Let
me explain a bit about Asperger's.
Yeah, please.
So this is a I think one of the things you need to understand that there's a historical aspect to the use of these labels. Okay, so in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, autism was Rain Man. Right. So if you could speak, or if you were cognitively able, you were extremely unlikely to get an autism label, okay? And that film Rain Man really was a terrific depiction.
Oh, it was huge, wasn't it?
Of what doctors and the community understood of autism, okay? And mums got the blame from these Freudian, psychotherapists and called mums refrigerator mothers, cold mothers. You didn't bond well enough with your baby. That's why he's trapped in his own little bubble. You need twice a week psychotherapy with me to unlock him. So it was a disaster. You can imagine as a poor mum being sort of blamed. And then the doyen of autism, as far as I'm concerned, the number one person in the area, and she sadly passed away a few years ago. Her name's Lorna Wing, and I was very lucky to do...
Did she pass away?
Yes. So,
I Googled her the other day.
Yeah. I was lucky, she collected some data for me for my PhD, actually. So I was very lucky. I met her a number of times, and Judy Gould. And so Lorna had a severely autistic daughter and sort of became a self-taught whiz, but... was working in the British school. She was a psychiatrist and was working in the British school system, was coming across kids that she thought were higher functioning versions of her daughter, but were getting mislabelled as naughty, poorly parented, ADD, oppositional defiant. And she thought perhaps these kids are sort of higher functioning versions of her daughter. So Lorna and a few others tried to get the term up, which you'll come across, high functioning autism in the 70s, but it didn't take because that word autism back then had a lot of baggage of the last 30 plus years of being Rain Man. So then she came across Asperger's writings. So Hans Asperger was an Austrian paediatrician during the Second World War, had a clinic full of higher functioning able kids that were struggling either at home or at school. The Nazis were killing kids that were different and disabled.
Yes.
And he wrote these beautiful case studies about these kids. Really sort of, I think the motive was to keep them alive. His clinic got bombed, his writings disappeared. Lorna came across them, had them translated. And this is where it got very complicated. She wrote a paper in the early 80s, and I still read this paper every few years, asking, really the world's interested people, what's the difference between these Asperger kiddies during the war and autistic kids? And so this area just took off. So in the 90s actually became very trendy to have an Aspie kid. But the diagnostic manual that we use, the DSM, get very antsy when people are using labels without good criteria. So this went on for a long, long time. And so Lorna suggested to use the term spectrum, but the diagnostic manual, the DSM, didn't want to use it because they're, I shouldn't talk about this, but they're sort of beholden to American insurance companies, and they didn't want to fund the whole. So they just said, no, we'll have what they called, and this is where it got very messy. They called it they said there were 3 pervasive developmental disorders. Autism was one, Asperger's first term was mentioned. Here's some pretty rubbish criteria. And then they had an autism kind of light category, which a lot of our girls got, and they called it PDD, so pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. So nobody kind of knew what it meant, but a mum would leave a clinic saying, my daughter's got PDD and OS, not Asperger's. The Aspie tribe would say, I've got Asperger's, I don't have autism. So that's how the medical model works. It tries to chop things up into little boxes, right? So this became very tricky, and the criteria were terrible. And so this is actually, I'm rabbiting on about this. This is what I did in my PhD, so I could talk about this for hours.
Brilliant.
And so what we did was look at, well, are these, are there indeed separate groups, or is it a spectrum? And basically my research, and Lorna and Margot Pryor and Sue Legham, we all found that there was more evidence for a spectrum rather than these artificial. So it wasn't just us, but a few others found the same thing. So then the diagnostic manual, the DSM, gets updated on the research, and that's why they came out and they said, actually, this was a bit of a blunder. There ain't no 3 PDDs. It's a they had to use the term spectrum because all the data was going that way. So the Aspie tribe got very offended, said, they're getting rid of us. But they needed sort of education to say, look, it's all autism. Lorna, before she died, she was asked, I think, and I'm paraphrasing here, are you unhappy that they're getting rid of Asperger's out of the diagnostic book? Because you kind of brought it into the world. And she kind of said, well, no, I just use this term to push everybody's understanding out. So you could be, a psychologist getting diagnosed, or you could be a Rain Man. So that's what Asperger's did. It sort of pushed everybody's understanding out of the multitude of presentations. So Asperger's came to sort of be known as, you've got those autistic things, but you're likely to have higher IQ and a lot more social. So I'll often say, and there's lots of DVDs and books and things, and websites with Asperger's in the title. And a lot of people sort of like that term, and I've got I'll often put in my reports, this person has an autism spectrum disorder, and then I'll put in brackets Asperger's type to kind of push people to sort of read there's some terrific, materials with that term in there. So I just say to people, don't get caught up on the labels because it all means the same thing. And I'll tell you, Gemma, there's research continuing, and the diagnostic manual has never stayed the same when it comes to autism. So the next time it comes out, they're likely to change the whole darn thing again. So maybe we're not going to have autism spectrum disorder next time. Maybe we'll have social communication disorder.
Look, I don't know. I've found that labels are more helpful to manipulate people than they are. So if I want my child to get into special school, I say he's got autism. And if I want my child to get into mainstream school, I say he's got Asperger's. And if I want someone to be nicer to my kid, I go, don't do that, he's got autism. But if I call it blue elephant's disease if it gets me somewhere with my kid, I don't care what it says on that label. The label thing for me is I'll use whatever I can if it gets my kid the help that he needs.
I mean, I think the autism spectrum, a lot of people say I'm on the spectrum or I'm an autie, but do I care if people say they're an Aspie? I don't care. I mean, what I'm rapt about is that we've gotten rid of the term PDD and PDD in OS because that was a disaster.
I'm still seeing it.
Yeah, so that there were people very beholden to that. There was a paediatrician in Melbourne that, basically if you weren't rocking and flapping, but you were a bit autistic, you'd come out with PDD and OS. And so, and when I'd see that, I just knew that if they'd been on that side of town, they'd gone through that pediatrician.